Ned Stark stood on the battlements of Winterfell one crisp morning, watching his breath turn to pale mist in the cold northern air. The rising sun bathed the ancient castle in soft gold, melting the last traces of frost that clung to the stones. Summer was lingering, but this far north, the mornings could still carry the promise of winter. He was alone, wrapped in a dark cloak trimmed with fur. The wind toyed with his hair, which had begun to show strands of silver, and he wore the solemn expression of a man weighed down by countless responsibilities. Lord Eddard Stark, Warden of the North, took slow steps along the battlements, his gaze drifting across the familiar courtyard below. On most days, his mind might be fixed on the condition of the crops, the training of young soldiers, or the many demands of ruling so vast a territory. But that morning, he was consumed by thoughts of a different nature. Marriage, alliances, and the precarious state of the Seven Kingdoms. In his chambers the previous night, a raven had arrived with a message from the Reach. Lord Mace Tyrell proposed a match. One of his daughters, his precious Margaery, was of marriageable age. The Tyrells, second only to the Lannisters in wealth and influence, sought to tie themselves to the great northern house. While it was common for powerful lords to arrange such unions to solidify alliances, the letter hinted at something more significant. The Tyrells, keen to display their loyalty and fortify their position in the face of growing unrest throughout the realm, had expressed an earnest desire to connect with House Stark. After all, the Tyrells had once stood with House Targaryen during Robert's rebellion, only to be spared harsh penalties when King Robert ascended the throne. Their loyalty now was meant to be unwavering, but the future of Westeros was always in flux. Ned had read Lord Mace Tyrell's flattering words with mild surprise. He knew the Tyrells to be ambitious, but he also knew them to be proud. For them to solicit a union felt indicative of carefully calculated intentions. Normally, a match might be sought with Robb, Ned's oldest trueborn son and heir to Winterfell, but the letter specified a different groom, Jon Snow. The prospect had startled Ned so thoroughly that he had read the letter a second time in the glow of a dimming candle, certain he must have misunderstood. Jon was a bastard, Ned's bastard, and never before had Ned considered him in such a way. It was unconventional to match a highborn lady like Margaery Tyrell to a man with no true claim to a great house's name. But the letter strongly implied that this match would be a path toward goodwill and an unprecedented bond between the North and the Reach. Ned understood the reasons lurking beneath the surface of the proposal. House Tyrell might see it as a cunning move, tie the favored but allegedly illegitimate son of Eddard Stark to their family, and in doing so, extend their influence into the North without any direct challenge to House Stark's line of succession. Perhaps they even believed there was more to Jon's parentage than Ned had let on. Whispered rumors had always abounded regarding the circumstances of Jon Snow's birth. It was said by many that Ned's honor was too rigid for him to have sired a bastard in the way that was believed. But no matter the truth, Ned had never confirmed nor denied any rumor. He carried his secrets in stony silence. All the same, the letter was persuasive, hinting at the generosity of the Tyrells and the mutual benefits for the two families. The marriage could pave the way for bountiful trade, a vital supply of grain from the fertile lands of the Reach during hard winters, and an overt gesture of unity that might keep the Lannisters wary. The times were uncertain, with King Robert Baratheon's rule becoming more strained by the day. The crown was in debt. Tensions with the Targaryen exiles across the narrow sea were not as quiet as some might think, and rumor after rumor fluttered around the capital like crows. If a time of crisis came again, House Tyrell wanted a friend as steady as the North. Yet, as a father, though not legally recognized as Jon's father in the eyes of many, Ned felt torn. He was protective of Jon, worried for his bastard son's future, and anxious about thrusting him into the viper's nest of southern politics. And Margaery Tyrell was no mere girl. She was, by all accounts, clever, graceful, and destined for a high place. Offering her to Jon could either be a blessing or a trap. Ned was not so naive as to ignore the complexities. Still, the potential gains were immense, both for Jon and for House Stark. The alliance might strengthen the North's standing and bolster Jon's acceptance. Above all, Ned longed to see his son respected and safe in a world that often cast bastards aside. Jon Snow was training in the courtyard later that morning, sparring with Robb, Theon Greyjoy, and a few other young men. Despite the crispness in the air, Jon's skin glistened with sweat beneath his worn practice leathers, his dark hair clinging to his forehead. He moved with a grace that belied his stocky build, deftly blocking blows and returning them with speed and precision. When Ned made his way down to observe, he stood silently at the edge of the yard, arms folded, eyes flicking between the two half-brothers as they clashed wooden swords. Jon had an intensity about him that morning. He was quick to volunteer for any extra chores or additional sword drills. Perhaps he was trying to prove himself, to be worthy of something more than the label bastard of Winterfell. Ned watched him move, careful, relentless, determined. It was not lost on Ned that Jon's discipline and sense of honor mirrored his own. Whatever the realm's gossip might say, he knew, deep in his bones, that Jon was the finest young man in Winterfell. Seeing him, Ned felt both pride and a gnawing pang of guilt for all he had withheld from him. The wooden swords clattered, and Robb laughed as he stepped back to wipe his brow. "You're relentless today, Jon. Have you grown tired of me winning?" He grinned, and Jon rolled his eyes good-naturedly, leaning on his practiced sword. "If you call that winning, brother, I'd be happy to show you the difference," Jon replied, though he smiled too. Ned stepped forward, clearing his throat. "You both did well," he said, nodding approvingly. His eyes lingered on Jon. "Come, Jon, walk with me a while." Robb, Theon, and the others paused to watch, curiosity flickering among them. Jon nodded, setting aside his wooden sword. He followed Ned across the courtyard, boots crunching lightly on the gravel. The morning sun was rising higher, bringing soft warmth to the stony grounds. They walked in silence, passing under the gatehouse and out into the training yard proper, where stable boys hurried by, leading horses out to graze. At last, Ned led Jon around a corner, away from prying eyes, to a secluded spot near an old oak that had stood within Winterfell's walls for generations. Jon looked at Ned with quiet respect. "You wish to see me, my lord?" The formality in Jon's voice stung Ned a little, as it always did. He placed a hand on Jon's shoulder and studied him with careful thought. "I have received a letter," Ned said. "It concerns you and a proposal that was not what I expected." Jon's brows knitted, confusion mingling with a hint of anxiety in his dark gray eyes. "Me, my lord." He stood straighter, almost defensive, as though expecting some new slight. Bastards were not often the subject of positive tidings. "A marriage proposal," Ned clarified. "Lord Mace Tyrell of Highgarden has offered his daughter, Margaery, to wed you." Jon's surprise was immediate. His mouth parted, but no words came out. He shook his head slightly, as if he had misheard. "His daughter? Margaery Tyrell. She's highborn. And I—" He trailed off, eyes flitting downward. "I am a bastard." Ned cleared his throat, glancing away for a moment. "It's not the usual arrangement, no. But the Tyrells see something in you, or see something in House Stark's favor. This could be a path toward an alliance that binds the North and the Reach. It would elevate your station, Jon, and it would secure our ties to one of the most powerful families in Westeros." An uncertain silence fell between them. Jon stared at the ground for a moment before daring to meet Ned's eyes again. "But why me? Why not Robb?" There was no malice in his tone, only genuine confusion. He had always been taught to know his place. Ned let out a slow breath. "Lord Tyrell specified you, Jon. The letter hinted at a desire for mutual benefit without complicating succession. And there may be other reasons," whispered rumors. "Regardless, I won't force you to accept something you do not want. But I must tell you that I am inclined to consider this offer." Jon swallowed. He could scarcely believe what he was hearing. He had dreamed of belonging, of recognition, but he had never once imagined anything on this scale. Marriage to a daughter of Highgarden, a lady famed for her beauty and charm, a scion of one of the richest houses in the realm. Part of him wondered if this was some cruel joke. "I will do whatever you command, my lord," he said at last in a quiet voice. "But I do not see how Margaery Tyrell would want to be tied to a—" "You are my son," Ned said firmly, placing both hands on Jon's shoulders. "No matter what the world might say, you are my blood. If the Tyrells see fit to recognize that, I will not stand in the way. Think on it. This alliance may serve more than just politics." Jon's lips pressed into a thin line, and he nodded. He did not feel worthy, but he would not openly defy an arrangement that his Lord Father believed important. If anything, he would strive to prove himself. "Yes, father," he managed, the word father escaping him so rarely in public. "I'll think on it." Ned squeezed Jon's shoulder, then gave a nod. "Good. I will write to Lord Tyrell. We will see what terms might be reached. Until then, speak of this to no one else outside the family. We must be cautious." They parted ways. Jon went back to the training yard, but his heart was no longer in the sparring. He felt as though the entire world had shifted beneath him. Every time he swung his wooden sword, the image of some unknown southern lady with flowing brown hair and bright eyes hovered in his mind. Margaery Tyrell, the name itself was nearly mythic, spoken of in hushed tones around the castle by those who admired her rumored loveliness. Jon felt as though he were in a dream, uncertain whether he would soon be roused back to reality. Over the following weeks, letters flew between Winterfell and Highgarden, crisscrossing the realm on swift-winged ravens. Ned kept the discussions private, conferring only with Catelyn, who listened with a stony mask that betrayed little. She was polite enough not to speak ill of Jon, though she had never hidden her discomfort with his presence in her home. But she was also astute. She recognized that a bond with the Reach could prove more beneficial to her trueborn children as well, ensuring security for the entire family. If Margaery Tyrell was truly content with the match, perhaps this arrangement would help quell the never-ending tension around Jon's station. Eventually, a final message arrived, sealed with a golden rose. Lord Mace Tyrell's words were buoyant. He accepted the terms Ned had suggested, which included a substantial dowry, the promise of trade routes that would provide Winterfell with grain during harsh winters, and a future seat for Jon in a small estate near the border of the Reach and the Crownlands should the alliance require a watchful presence. Moreover, Margaery Tyrell herself would be escorted north, so that she and Jon might meet before final vows were spoken. It was all to be done under King Robert's blessing, of course, for marriages between great houses required royal approval. But Mace Tyrell had already secured the king's informal support by appealing to Robert's desire for stable alliances in his realm. Ned read the letter to Jon and felt the boy's tension grow. Excitement and trepidation danced in Jon's eyes. He had never thought to walk such a path. Neither had he dared to dream that the king himself would lend his blessing to his marriage. But so it was. As news spread quietly at first through Winterfell, Robb offered his half-brother heartfelt congratulations. Sansa, enthralled by the notion of any lady's marriage, especially one so grand, peppered Jon with questions about whether Margaery truly looked like the stories said. Arya, on the other hand, rolled her eyes at the fuss. Bran and Rickon were too young to grasp the full implications, but they knew enough to sense excitement when they saw it. Catelyn watched with a measured courtesy, as though waiting to see how this bold arrangement would unfold. She kept her distance from Jon, not wishing to dampen his spirits nor betray the carefully maintained peace in the castle. Still, from time to time, Jon felt her eyes upon him, and he wondered if she feared the ramifications of his ascension in station. But he did not dwell on it. Far more pressing in his mind was Margaery Tyrell herself. At last, word came that the Tyrell party would arrive at Winterfell before the new moon. An entire train of knights, ladies, servants, and armed men would make their way north, carrying the Lady Margaery in a grand litter. The day approached with a mixture of exhilaration and dread. On the morning they were expected, Winterfell bustled with activity. Servants rushed to prepare extra chambers, cooking fires roared in the kitchens, and the great hall was readied for a feast. Ned and his family, Jon included, stood in the courtyard, waiting to receive their honored guests. Snow did not yet fall, but the air was cool, a reminder that the northern autumn could be as chill as a southern winter. They spotted the Tyrell banners first, the golden rose on a field of green, rippling in the wind. The columns stretched along the winding road, bright with the colors of the Reach. Those who had never traveled south felt as though a piece of a warmer, more fertile land was rolling up to their gates. Knights in shining armor, horses draped in green and gold, ladies in flowing gowns embroidered with roses, and wagons carrying goods for trade and gifts for the Starks. It was a grand display of wealth and power. At the head of the procession rode Ser Loras Tyrell, famed as the Knight of Flowers, whose skill with a lance and sword was said to rival the best in Westeros. He wore a half-helm adorned with plumes and carried himself with regal grace, a living testament to the Tyrell name. Next to him, encased in a lavish litter drawn by sturdy northern horses, rode Margaery Tyrell. Jon tried to catch a glimpse but could only see the flutter of green and gold curtains. When at last the column entered the courtyard, squires rushed forward to help the riders dismount, while stable hands moved to care for the horses. Ser Loras emerged first, his gleaming armor reflecting the northern sun. He swept off his helm and bowed to Ned Stark with a flourish. Despite the grandeur, there was a politeness and an earnestness in the young knight's face. "My lord," he said, his voice carrying easily through the courtyard. "I am Ser Loras Tyrell, here in service of my father and to escort my sister. We thank you for your hospitality." Ned inclined his head. "Welcome to Winterfell, Ser Loras. We are honored by your presence." Then, as the litter's curtains were drawn back, Ned and the assembled Starks watched as Margaery Tyrell stepped out. She was dressed in a gown of soft green velvet, embroidered with golden roses along the bodice and sleeves. A matching cloak, lined with fur for warmth, hung gracefully around her shoulders. Though the chilly northern air brought color to her cheeks, she carried herself with composed elegance. Her hair was the rich brown color of warm honey in shadow, loosely curled and partially pinned back to reveal a graceful neck. From every angle, she exuded a gentle confidence. She smiled, and that alone seemed enough to thaw the cold northern morning. Margaery curtsied before Ned. "My Lord Stark," she said, her voice melodic yet firm. "It is an honor to visit your home and the lands of the north." Jon stood a half-step behind Ned. He felt his heart thudding in his chest. He had heard that Margaery Tyrell was beautiful, but words scarcely did her justice. There was something more than mere beauty in her face, an intelligence in her eyes, an earnest warmth in her smile. He realized with a jolt that his mouth had gone dry. Ned spoke formal words of welcome, inviting Margaery and Ser Loras inside. Then, gently, he stepped aside so Jon could be presented. Jon approached, feeling every inch the awkward youth he feared he might be. He bowed, hoping he did not look foolish. "My lady," he said quietly, "it is a pleasure to meet you." Margaery regarded him closely, her head tilting just so. She offered a warm smile and extended a hand. "Jon Snow," she said, letting his name linger softly in the air. "I am pleased to make your acquaintance." He took her hand lightly, aware of the curious eyes upon them. Margaery's hand was cool but steady. For a moment, Jon wondered if she might be as nervous as he felt, but she did not show it. I hope your journey was smooth," he managed, feeling a wave of self-consciousness. "It was long but pleasant," Margaery replied. She glanced around the courtyard, taking in the austere walls of Winterfell. "I must say, I have never traveled so far north. Already, I see beauty here that I could not have imagined." Her voice carried the trace of a courtly courtesy, but Jon sensed genuine curiosity behind her words. He found himself nodding in agreement, though it felt strange to hear his home described as beautiful by someone accustomed to the flowering fields of the Reach. Servants hurried forward to escort Margaery's retinue to their quarters. Ned invited Ser Loras to join him in a brief tour, while Margaery was shown to the suite of rooms prepared for her. Jon lingered, uncertain of his place. A short while later, though, he found himself in the great hall with Robb, Theon, and Sansa, all discussing the arrival of the Tyrells. Sansa was nearly breathless with excitement. "She's every bit as lovely as I imagined," Sansa gushed. And she dresses so finely. I've never seen a cloak with such rich embroidery. Have you? Robb shook his head. Never. But let's not act like starstruck children, Sansa. We should be gracious hosts. Sansa rolled her eyes at her older brother. I'm being perfectly gracious, she insisted. Then she turned to Jon. And what did you think, Jon? She seems kind, does she not? Jon felt warmth rush to his face. Yes, he said. She seems very kind. He could sense Theon smirking behind him, but for once Theon kept his jesting to himself. An alliance with the Tyrells was no trivial matter, and even Theon Greyjoy recognized that for House Stark to secure the friendship of the Reach could be momentous. That evening, the great hall was filled with the comforting aromas of spiced meats, fresh bread, and hearty stews, mingling with the tang of burning wood in the large hearth. The entire Tyrell party joined the Starks at the high table, their laughter and conversation a stark contrast to the more somber Northmen. Ser Loras spoke charmingly of Highgarden's splendors, from its famed tournaments to the gardens where every manner of flower bloomed year-round. Margaery contributed colorful anecdotes about life in the south, describing feasts filled with music and dancing under starry sky. Jon, seated beside her, tried his best to engage in conversation. She asked him about the North, its traditions, the stories of the old gods, the training regimen of the young soldiers. He did his utmost to answer without stumbling over his words. At one point, she gently touched his hand to emphasize a question about the weirwood trees in the Godswood, and Jon's heart hammered in his chest. He had no experience with courtly flirtation, and he found her attentiveness disarming. Over the next few days, Margaery settled into Winterfell's rhythms with surprising ease. She rose early, often visiting the courtyard to watch Jon and the other young men train at arms, her curious gaze falling on archery sessions and sword drills. She strolled through the castle's stone corridors, accompanied by a small entourage, but she seemed genuinely captivated by what she saw, pausing to inquire about details of northern architecture or glimpses of the Stark family's long history. It did not take long for the castle's inhabitants to warm to her. She made small gestures of kindness, praising the kitchen staff for their excellent meals, chatting warmly with Septas, even showing interest in some of the simpler aspects of daily life in Winterfell. After only a few days, Sansa idolized her entirely. Arya, though more aloof, grudgingly admitted that Margaery was not as insufferably prissy as she had anticipated. More importantly, Margaery and Jon spent increasing time together. At Ned's subtle encouragement, they walked through the Godswood, where the ancient weirwood's red leaves whispered in the chilly wind. Jon pointed out the carved face in the white bark, and Margaery listened with hushed awe as he spoke of how the Starks believed their ancestors' spirits watched over them through the weirwoods. Jon felt more at ease speaking in those quiet moments, away from prying eyes. He showed her the crypts beneath Winterfell, though he hesitated to go too far in the dark halls of the dead. She asked about his upbringing, what he loved most about the North, and whether he had any desire to travel the wider world. He answered honestly, though he felt a twinge of shame each time he considered his bastardy. One afternoon, they paused by a small pond in the Godswood, the surface partially frozen. Margaery drew her cloak tighter and looked up at Jon. "Why do you hesitate when you speak of your family?" she asked gently. "You love them deeply. I can see that in your eyes. But you speak as if you are separate." Jon swallowed, glancing at the ground. He did not wish to seem self-pitying. "They are my family," he said quietly. "But I am a bastard. That is how the world sees me, how many of them see me. I have always been on the outside." Margaery studied him with empathy in her dark eyes. "Yet, Lord Stark cherishes you. Your brothers do as well. Would you say that is not so?" He shook his head, managing a faint smile. "It is so. I know they care for me and I for them. But there are certain lines that I cannot cross, certain claims I cannot make. I learned that young. Yet here we are," Margaery said, her voice thoughtful. "You, a bastard of Winterfell, and I, a daughter of Highgarden, meant to be betrothed. The realm may whisper, but I have come to see that whispered words do not dictate the truth of what can be." She reached out to gently take his hand. Her skin felt cool in the northern air. "I do not fear your birth, Jon Snow. If we are to be wed, we shall define our own course." Jon felt an odd mix of relief and wonder at her boldness. He searched her face, trying to discern if it was merely politeness or something deeper. But Margaery Tyrell was adept at letting the warmth of her sincerity shine through her courtly graces. He felt, for the first time, that she might truly mean what she said. Over the weeks that followed, their interactions grew more comfortable. Jon found that conversation came more easily, especially when it centered around practical matters rather than the formalities of nobility. He guided Margaery through Winterfell's library, showing her ancient tomes and genealogies. She delighted in hearing stories of Brandon the Builder, the White Walkers, and the Savage Knights of the Long Night. In turn, she told him about Highgarden's fabled history, of its founding by Garth Greenhand, and the many legends of the Reach. Both of them shared a love for the histories of the Seven Kingdoms, though each viewed them through different lenses. Of course, courtly life was not without its intrigues. The Tyrell retinue included older lords and ladies who exchanged knowing glances whenever Jon and Margaery spent time alone, their whispers trailing through the corridors. Jon felt their eyes on him, weighing him, assessing if he was worthy of the Tyrell rose. He could not deny feeling self-conscious, but Margaery rarely seemed bothered by it. Whenever she caught a whiff of disapproval, she countered it with courtesy, or a charming compliment that left her critics momentarily disarmed. Eventually, the day arrived for the official betrothal ceremony, a simpler affair than a full wedding, but important nonetheless. Ned had arranged it to be held in the Great Hall before a modest gathering of nobles, bannermen, and key members of the Tyrell entourage. King Robert's written approval had been sent north, sealed with the royal stamp. He had no apparent objections to the match. Most likely, it suited him fine to keep the Tyrells content, and if House Stark was in favor, all the better for peace in the realm. The Great Hall was adorned with both the dire wolf of House Stark and the golden rose of House Tyrell. Torches crackled along the walls, casting flickering light across the stone floors. The hall was warm, the heat from the great hearth battling the northern chill outside. A hush fell as Ned, standing at the head of the chamber, beckoned Jon and Margaery to step forward. Jon's heart throbbed in his chest as he guided Margaery forward on his arm. She was garbed in a deep emerald gown, embroidered with subtle silver thread to honor House Stark. It was a subtle statement, unity between the North and the Reach. Margaery's hair was arranged with delicate braids, and a single silver rose pin adorned the side. Jon wore his best clothing, a dark tunic bearing the sigil of House Stark, though smaller than the one Robb might wear. The idea had been to show respect for Jon's heritage without overstepping. Ned, with Catelyn at his side, spoke solemn words about honor, duty, and family, referencing the old gods as well as the faith of the Seven to reflect the union of the two houses. As Ned read out the terms of the betrothal, the crowd listened intently. Robb stood near his father, his expression proud and supportive, while Sansa all but glowed at the romance of it all. Arya looked half fascinated, half exasperated by the ceremony. Bran and Rickon squirmed a little but tried to watch quietly. Ser Loras stood behind his sister, a calm smile on his face, though Jon thought he caught a flicker of concern in the knight's eyes, as if he was thinking about the complexities of politics. When the moment came for Jon to speak his vow, he felt the weight of 100 gazes on him. He inhaled, voice steady. "I, Jon Snow, do solemnly pledge my troth to Margaery Tyrell. I will honor her, protect her, and stand by her side, as our two houses become one, by the grace of the old gods and the new." Margaery's voice rang softly but clearly through the hall. "I, Margaery of House Tyrell, do pledge my troth to Jon Snow. I will honor him, support him, and uphold the bonds between our houses, before gods old and new." Ned took their hands and wrapped them in a strip of cloth bearing both sigils, tying them together lightly. "By the will of the gods, and by the witness of men, House Stark and House Tyrell are now bound by this betrothal. May the union bring prosperity and unity to both our lands." A gentle applause rippled through the hall. Margaery glanced up at Jon, a soft smile curving her lips. For a moment, all the politics and intrigue receded, and Jon felt only the warmth of her hand in his. A wave of relief and contentment washed over him, tempered by the knowledge that challenges would undoubtedly come. But for that moment, he allowed himself a rare sense of hope. Afterward, there was a small feast, a celebration of music, dance, and conversation. The hall rang with laughter and the clinking of cups, the roasting meats and fresh bread devoured amid talk of the future. Ser Loras led Margaery out to the floor for the first dance, a graceful turn that brought murmurs of approval from the guests. Then, Loras guided Margaery to Jon, stepping aside so that the two betrothed might share a dance. Jon's chest tightened with nerves. He was not known for his dancing. Margaery, noticing his hesitation, whispered, "It's just a few steps, Jon. Don't worry. I'm not so strict a teacher." Jon offered a self-conscious half-smile and placed one hand on her waist while holding her hand in the other. The music was soft, a gentle lilt that the minstrels had likely practiced for days. Though Jon was far from an accomplished dancer, Margaery guided him subtly, and he managed to keep pace. There was something intimate about being so close, the swirl of her dress brushing against his legs, her perfume faintly floral in the air. His heart hammered, but he kept his composure. Margaery's eyes shone with encouragement, and he gradually relaxed. They spoke only a few words, light banter about the dance, the feast, the watchful eyes upon them. But the moment felt monumental to Jon. He caught glimpses of Sansa beaming, of Robb clapping in time to the music, and even Arya offering a grudging nod of approval. The dance ended to polite applause, and they took their seats again, breath slightly quickened. Once the formalities were concluded, the real test began. How would Winterfell and the North adapt to Margaery's presence? And how would the Tyrell envoys adjust to the cold realities of life beyond the Neck? The weeks stretched into months as the final details of the wedding were planned, though no firm date was set yet. It was decided that Margaery would remain in Winterfell for a while, to learn the northern customs and to give Jon and her time to truly know each other, a courtesy not always granted in highborn marriages. The Tyrell contingent would come and go, ensuring that news traveled back to Highgarden, but Margaery and a small retinue stayed behind. Over those months, Margaery became a familiar sight in the castle's corridors. She learned the names of many servants and guards, won them over with genuine conversation and small acts of kindness. She spent hours with the Septa in the small sept of Winterfell, praying and reflecting, though she also visited the Godswood, quietly curious about the old gods and the ancient ways of the North. At mealtimes, she conversed with the Stark children, encouraging Sansa's interest in courtly manners and exchanging quips with Arya that ranged from archery contests to the best ways to bake bread. Even Catelyn, who maintained a measured distance initially, seemed to soften under Margaery's thoughtful gestures, like inquiring politely after Catelyn's father, Lord Hoster Tully, or praising the tapestries that Catelyn had overseen in the castle. Jon found himself in an unusual position, no longer simply the watcher from the sidelines, but the center of many people's attention. He would walk with Margaery around the battlements, discussing the daily workings of Winterfell, or they would ride out together near the Wolfswood, accompanied by a small escort, to show her the rolling hills and scattered pines of the northern landscape. On these rides, they sometimes stopped at small villages, where Margaery would greet the locals with a mix of southern charm and earnest respect. The small folk were intrigued. They had never seen a lady from the south quite like her. Jon could see how deftly she navigated these interactions, never condescending, always polite, and it made him admire her all the more. In private moments, they spoke of the future. Margaery asked about Jon's aspirations, whether he could see himself ruling a keep or forging alliances in King's Landing. Jon hesitated. He had never dreamed such ambitions. He had once thought of joining the Night's Watch, a path his uncle Benjen had walked, largely because he believed no other respectable path was open to him. Now, that future was cast aside by this betrothal. He confessed to Margaery his uncertainty. She listened intently. "Perhaps you can do both in a way," she suggested one evening. as they sat in a quiet corner of Winterfell's library, the glow of candlelight illuminating dust motes in the air. If you wish to fight for the realm, to serve with honor, that can be done in many ways. You needn't wear black to be honorable, Jon. He studied her face, the flickering candlelight dancing across her features. I've never known what else to do, he admitted softly. Now, my life has changed so abruptly. Margaery reached out, gently taking his hand. Sometimes the gods, old or new, lead us down unexpected roads. Perhaps it was meant to be. Then she leaned forward, her voice softening. I know that when we marry, our responsibilities will shift. We will have to represent House Stark and House Tyrell, keep the peace, see to matters in both the North and the Reach. But in that, we can find our own purpose. There is goodness in you, Jon, and I suspect there is greatness, too. Her words lingered in Jon's mind long after he left the library. It felt like a heavy mantle placed upon his shoulders, but a mantle he might one day wear with some measure of pride, if she was there to share the burden. Yet not all was idyllic. Whispers from the south began to reach Winterfell that tensions in King's Landing were rising. Lord Tywin Lannister was rumored to be displeased at the Tyrells' growing influence. The crown's debts to the Iron Bank of Bravos were mounting, and rumors circulated about Daenerys Targaryen across the Narrow Sea, possibly forging alliances of her own. Even in Winterfell, occasional ravens brought updates that gave Ned cause for concern. Jon saw his Lord Father's brow crease more frequently, and though Ned tried to shield his children from the darker tidings, Jon was now drawn into more council discussions than ever before. One day, after receiving an ominous raven from King's Landing, Ned emerged from his solar, face grim, and asked for Margaery and Jon to join him. They gathered in Ned's private chambers, with only Catelyn and a couple of trusted advisors present. Ned laid out a parchment on the table. King Robert's hunts have been growing more extravagant, Ned said, voice tinged with frustration. He empties the royal coffers as if they were a bottomless well. Lord Tywin is pressuring the crown for repayment of borrowed gold. And now, I hear that Lord Renly Baratheon is entertaining thoughts of his own claim should the throne be contested. Margaery listened intently, her expression composed but serious. My father wrote that the tensions between the Tyrells and the Lannisters are quiet, but not absent. Cersei Lannister likely disdains the idea of a Tyrell ally so close to the north. Ned nodded. Yes, and so we must move wisely. Our alliance must be strong, not just in name but in deeds. There is talk that King Robert wants to visit Winterfell again for another grand hunt. If that comes to pass, we must be prepared for the weight of the crown's gaze upon us. And possibly the Lannisters as well. He turned his steady gray eyes to Jon. This betrothal was a calculated step, but the stakes have risen. If war or strife threatens, the North and the Reach must stand firm together. Once you are wed, your bond will be more than symbolic. It may be the foundation of alliances that stave off chaos. Jon glanced at Margaery, seeing the determination in her eyes. They had grown closer these past months, developing a tentative but genuine affection. He realized that the realm's politics could place them both on a perilous path. If the Lannisters perceived the Tyrells as a threat, if any conflict erupted over the throne, their marriage would be a rallying symbol for both houses, and possibly a target. Margaery drew a steady breath. Then we must ensure the wedding is a declaration of unity. The North and the Reach together. My father will be eager to display his power and wealth, of course. But it must also honor Northern traditions. That will send a message that we are truly joined, not just in name. Ned's gaze flicked to Catelyn, who nodded in agreement. I will help you plan, Catelyn said quietly. We will find a balance between the old gods and the new. The entire realm will see that House Tyrell is not overshadowing House Stark, nor vice versa. Jon listened, heart pounding in his chest. The weight of the realm's politics felt heavy indeed. Yet, a part of him found solace in the presence of Margaery at his side, someone who shared the burden of bridging two great houses. He had never expected to find such partnership in this arranged betrothal, but there it was. And though he still grappled with doubts about his place, He reminded himself that he was not alone. Winter slowly tightened its grip on the north, the days growing shorter and the winds sharper. Snow came late that year, flurries dusting Winterfell's battlements and drifting into the courtyard. Margaery's cheeks became rosier in the chill, and she switched her light cloaks for thicker, fur-lined ones. Yet she scarcely complained, remarking instead on the stark beauty of a snow-covered landscape. One evening, she and Jon stood atop a tower, gazing out over the white-blanketed fields beyond the castle walls. Pale moonlight illuminated the snow, giving it a silvery sheen. From that vantage point, Winterfell looked both imposing and serene. The flickering lights in the windows below spoke of warmth amidst the cold. Jon took in a breath of icy air, letting it fill his lungs. He turned to Margaery. "You've grown accustomed to the cold," he remarked softly. "I remember how you trembled that first morning you arrived." She smiled, hugging her cloak closer. "I won't pretend it's easy, but there's a purity to the North's chill. In Highgarden, everything is lush and warm, but sometimes it feels too easy, too soft. Here, one must be strong, and it shapes the people who live here." He nodded. "You speak like one of the Northerners now." Margaery's smile grew wistful. "I've come to love it here, Jon, and I'm not afraid for the future." He studied her in the moonlight, the subtle shadows on her face. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine a life with her, whether in Winterfell or some keep under his command. A shared life of duty, yes, but perhaps also of warmth and partnership. "Margaery," he murmured, stepping closer. "There's something I wish to say." She turned her gaze fully on him. He could see the curiosity and anticipation in her eyes. He hesitated, uncertain of how to find the words. He was no poet, no graceful knight with silvered tongue. But he summoned courage. I know this marriage was arranged for reasons of state," he began, "and we have followed the steps expected of us. But I want you to know that I do not see you as just a political partner. You have shown me kindness, understanding, and I care for you." He paused, swallowing, uncertain if he had said it right or if it was too blunt. Margaery's expression softened. She reached up, gently touching his cheek with a gloved hand. "Jon Snow," she said, voice tender, "you have been more than I ever expected. I see the honor in you, the goodness. Though we were brought together by our families, I do not regret it. I too care for you." A delicate silence hung in the frosty air. Before Jon could overthink it, Margaery leaned in, pressing her lips to his in a gentle kiss. He startled at first, the warmth of her mouth a sudden contrast to the cold wind. But then he returned the kiss with quiet longing. For a few heartbeats, the world narrowed to just the two of them standing on that tower, snow swirling around them like silent witnesses. When they parted, his breath caught in his throat, and Margaery's cheeks were flushed. Later, Jon would reflect that that moment was when he truly began to see Margaery as his match in every sense. A woman who understood duty but also possessed a heart capable of genuine affection. He felt a stirring of protectiveness for her, mixed with an unaccustomed sense of joy. Bastard or not, he was allowed this, a connection that transcended the circumstances of his birth. Yet, beneath the moonlight kisses and blossoming affection, the specter of politics loomed. Letters from Highgarden arrived, urging the wedding date to be set, eager to showcase the union to the entire realm. King Robert's court was abuzz with rumors that the king himself planned to visit the north again, possibly to confirm the wedding in person. Lord Tywin Lannister sent polite, measured congratulations but made no mention of any gifts. In the shadows, Ned's northern bannermen speculated on what it meant to have a Tyrell lady so close to the Stark heir, bastard or no. Tensions simmered as the path to the wedding began to crystallize. The wedding was proposed for early spring, when the roads might be passable enough for southern guests to arrive, and the northern snows receded at least a little. Margaery's family wanted a grand display that would reinforce the alliance's significance. Ned, practical as ever, insisted that the festivities not exceed what Winterfell and the local towns could reasonably support, mindful of not straining resources as winter's edge still lingered. Amid these preparations, Margaery expressed a desire to truly see more of the North. She gently insisted that any wedding in Winterfell must reflect the land's spirit and the old gods that Jon so revered. Jon, intrigued by the notion, proposed a short journey to nearby holdfasts under Winterfell's domain. They would not stray too far, as the roads were increasingly treacherous, but enough to visit some of Ned's bannermen, gather their sentiments, and let Margaery observe more of northern customs firsthand. Ned agreed, seeing the wisdom of such an endeavor. If Margaery was to be the lady of a keep in the north, possibly even Winterfell itself should something happen to Robb in the far future, she must understand the land and its people. And if they visited the Umbers, the Boltons, the Karstarks, or others, she would gain valuable insight into how the North truly functioned. So it was arranged that Jon and Margaery, accompanied by a small retinue, would travel to a few select locations north of Winterfell for a couple of weeks, paying visits and delivering tokens of the alliance. Robb and Theon would remain behind to assist Ned with matters in Winterfell, while a handful of guards and maesters accompanied the betrothed couple. The roads were icy and conditions harsh, but Margaery insisted she could manage. Setting out on horseback, Jon rode by Margaery's side. She wore a thick fur cloak, and her mare was sturdy, bred for northern terrain. Jon led Ghost, his direwolf, alongside them, the great white beast padding silently through the snow. Margaery had only met Ghost briefly, but she had not flinched from the direwolf's size. In truth, she seemed fascinated by Ghost, gently holding out her hand to let him sniff, though the direwolf was characteristically reserved with strangers. Still, he tolerated her presence, which was more than could be said for many others. Their first stop was a modest holdfast belonging to a minor house sworn to House Stark. The yard was muddy where the snow had partially melted, and the wooden palisade walls were old, but well maintained. The local lord greeted them respectfully, providing a hearty meal of stewed venison and dark bread. Though not a place of shining beauty, Margaery treated their hosts with the same courtesy she would have shown a lord in Highgarden. She listened to their concerns, asked about their families, and expressed genuine interest in how they endured the colder seasons. Each place they visited, Margaery's graciousness won hearts. Lords and ladies alike appreciated her sincerity. Small folk recognized her warmth. Jon could see them wondering about the match, why a lady of the Reach would wed a northern bastard. But he also saw them accepting her, bit by bit, as if the entire North was slowly extending cautious approval. One chilly afternoon, as they traveled toward a watchtower near the last river, the snowfall intensified, large flakes drifting down to clothe the world in white. The group had to slow their horses, the wind picking up and howling across the plains. Ghost stayed close, sniffing the air warily. Jon sensed the change in weather and signaled the party to halt in the shelter of a copse of pine trees. "We should wait here until the wind dies down," Jon told Margaery, raising his voice over the gale. He pointed to the pines, their thick branches providing some protection from the worst of the blowing snow. Margaery nodded, gripping her reins. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold. "You know best," she called. Despite the biting chill, she managed a smile. "Though I must say, I did not expect such sudden fury from the northern skies." They guided their mounts beneath the pine canopy, forming a rough circle. The guards dismounted, helping tie the horses and build a small fire. Jon and Margaery huddled near Ghost, whose thick fur seemed unbothered by the weather. "Is it always like this?" Margaery asked, pulling her cloak tighter. Jon shook his head. "Northern weather can be unpredictable, but this storm came quickly. We'll be safe here. Once it passes, we can continue, or find a nearby village to shelter for the night." The wind howled, rattling the branches above. Snow fell in swirling patterns, the world beyond the pines becoming a gray-white blur. For a moment, Margaery closed her eyes, letting the cold wash over her. Then she turned to Jon. "I'll cherish this memory," she said softly. "Someday, when I'm in Highgarden or King's Landing under a scorching sun, I'll recall the day we sheltered together in a snowstorm under pine trees." Jon smiled, a small but genuine grin. "You might be the only Southerner who would cherish such a memory." She laughed softly, leaning her head on his shoulder. The storm raged around them, but within the shelter of pines and their small fire, Jon felt a sense of peace. The men-at-arms bustled about, ensuring the horses were calm and the fire stoked. It was, in many ways, an ordinary inconvenience of northern travel. Yet, sharing it with Margaery made it feel more like an unexpected adventure, a moment of intimacy that bound them together more than any formal ceremony could. They waited until twilight, when the wind finally eased, and then pressed on carefully to the next village, guided by Jon's knowledge of the land. By the time they arrived, the locals were shutting their doors against the cold, but the sight of Stark banners earned them quick entrance. They spent the night in a cramped but warm hall, dining on simple fare. Margaery showed no complaint, earning the locals' admiration. She listened to their stories of hardships, offered words of encouragement, and praised the resilience of the North. Such experiences repeated throughout their short journey. It was not glamorous by Southern standards, no ornate feasts or tournaments, but it was authentic. Jon saw Margaery's determination, her willingness to adapt, and her compassion for those living in harsher circumstances than any she had ever known. In turn, Margaery witnessed Jon's deep respect for the people, his quiet sense of duty, and the calm leadership he displayed in ensuring everyone's safety. They were forging a bond far stronger than any parchment could decree. When at last they turned back toward Winterfell, they had been gone nearly 2 weeks. The heavy clouds broke on the final day of travel, revealing a pale sun that glinted off snowdrifts. Winterfell's gray walls appeared on the horizon like a sentinel of stone, a welcome sight for weary travelers. As they rode under the gatehouse, they were greeted by guards and stable hands who rushed forward to assist. They found Ned in the courtyard, arms folded in a posture of mild concern. He relaxed visibly when he saw them return unscathed, though he noticed the tiredness in their eyes and the dusting of snow that still clung to their cloaks. Margaery dismounted with Jon's assistance, and the two made their way to Lord Stark. "Welcome home," Ned said, a hint of warmth in his reserved tone. "I heard the snows were heavier than expected. I trust you both are well." Margaery bowed her head respectfully. "We are, Lord Stark. Jon guided us safely. He's quite the capable leader." Ned looked at Jon, pride in his gaze. "Good. Go inside, warm yourselves, and we'll speak of your travels." "Your mother." Ned paused, carefully selecting his words. "Lady Stark will want to see you both." Jon nodded, not missing the slight shift in Ned's expression. In time, perhaps, that tension would fade, though he doubted it. For now, he was simply relieved to be home. He glanced at Margaery, who offered him a small smile of shared understanding. That evening, in the warmth of the great hall, Margaery recounted their journey to an attentive Catelyn, Robb, Sansa, and the other Starks. She spoke of the generosity of the small folk, the stark beauty of the northern hills, and the trust she felt blossoming between their houses. Sansa listened with rapt attention, occasionally stealing glances at Jon and Margaery that suggested she had grand romantic notions swirling in her mind. Once their meal was done, Jon excused himself to check on Ghost and ensure the direwolf was settled. Margaery followed a few minutes later, slipping out of the great hall to find him in the courtyard. Snow drifted gently in the lamplight, and Jon stood beside Ghost, running a hand through the direwolf's thick fur. "Needed some air?" she asked, her tone light. Jon turned, nodding. "Something like that. Ghost doesn't like the noise of the hall sometimes." She stepped closer, wrapping her cloak around her. "It's understandable. Even I find the hall overwhelming at times." Jon smiled faintly. "I never thought I'd hear a Tyrell say that." Margaery let out a soft laugh, the sound echoing off the courtyard walls. She reached out and placed a gentle hand on his arm. For a moment, they stood like that, quietly taking in the falling snow. The alliance that had begun as a letter from the Reach was now shaping into something meaningful. A real connection between two people who had once been strangers from very different worlds. They had no illusions. The realm's politics were unstable, and war or betrayal could lie ahead. But for that single, snow-dusted moment in Winterfell's courtyard, the future felt open with possibilities. and standing together, they found warmth that outshone the biting cold of the north. In time, the wedding date would be set. Lords and ladies would converge on Winterfell, or so Margaery's father intended, bearing gifts, wealth, and their own hidden agendas. The crown would watch with interest, as would the Lannisters. But Jon Snow and Margaery Tyrell would walk into that uncertain future with the beginnings of a genuine bond, born of shared trials, honest conversations, and kindness that bridged the gap between a bastard of the North and a Rose of the Reach. And perhaps, with that bond, they might weather whatever storms the realm had yet to unleash upon them. Winter's icy grip tightened on the north as the final stretch of snow-coated weeks passed. Winterfell, with its ancient walls and steaming hot springs, stood firm against the cold, a beacon of warmth amid a harsh landscape. And within those walls, the betrothal of Jon Snow and Margaery Tyrell continued to spark conversations, hopes, and the occasional flash of intrigue among lords, ladies, and servants alike. Ned Stark had seen many of his children grow under this roof, watched them chase each other in the courtyards, taught them the meaning of duty and honor in the Godswood. But not once had he envisioned a Tyrell living under his roof, let alone betrothed to his bastard son. The strangeness had slowly faded, replaced by a mounting realization that this union might well be a cornerstone in the realm's future. Margaery Tyrell was a calming presence, her lively wit and gentleness marking her as distinctly southern but no less admirable in the North's eyes. In the weeks following Jon and Margaery's return from their short travels to outlying holdfasts, life at Winterfell settled into a different rhythm. More letters began to arrive from the south, some from Mace Tyrell, some from King's Landing, and yet others from Ned's own sister-by-law, the Queen. Cersei's correspondences were always impeccably polite, laced with compliments and bland assurances that the crown looked forward to hearing of the marriage's success. But there was an undercurrent to her words that set Ned's instincts on edge. Cersei's gaze was upon the north, and Ned did not trust her. Meanwhile, Margaery spent part of each day conversing with Catelyn, Sansa, or Maester Luwin, learning the intricacies of the North's customs and needs. She was fascinated by local traditions, whether it was the emphasis on honoring the old gods by leaving offerings at the weirwood tree, or the ceremonies marking the changing of seasons. She asked innumerable questions, soaking up every detail. More than once, Catelyn had to stifle a reluctant admiration for Margaery's diligence and charm. Tension still lay between Catelyn and Jon Snow, an unspoken line that had existed since the day he arrived at Winterfell as an infant. But if there was one woman who could pour oil on troubled waters, it seemed to be Margaery Tyrell. Jon, for his part, occupied a strange space between duty and longing. He continued to train with his half-brothers and Theon, studying at Maester Luwin's side to better understand the administrative tasks required of a minor lord. His mind churned with the realization that his future might be nothing like the lonely path he had once envisaged. In quiet moments, he often found himself recalling those nights of conversation with Margaery under the pine trees, or the hush of their shared travels through the snowy roads. She had become real to him, not just a betrothal arrangement, but a partner who recognized his worth despite his bastardy. He felt a surge of gratitude and a hint of awe whenever he allowed himself to believe it. Yet, as the day of the wedding approached, the realm's tensions grew. Whispers from King's Landing spoke of mounting debts, of Lord Tywin's displeasure, of King Robert's continued indulgences. There were rumors of Targaryen intrigues across the sea, of Sellsword companies forming around the exiled Prince Viserys and his sister Daenerys. But to most in the north, these concerns remained distant, intangible. The eyes of House Stark and of Jon Snow were fixed on the immediate future, forging a strong alliance with House Tyrell and sealing it with sacred vows. When the roads grew marginally passable in the New Year's spring thaw, still cold, but not so bitter as to deter southern visitors, the first envoys arrived at Winterfell. Knights of the Reach, wearing cloaks of green and gold, rode in with small retinues. Old Lord Randall Tarley, stern-faced and imposing, came to represent the martial backbone of the Tyrell bannermen. Lady Alice Beesbury, a distant cousin of the Tyrells, arrived in a clatter of carriages carrying rolls of fine cloths and barrels of wine from the arbor. The courtyard grew full with unfamiliar faces from the south, mingling with the North's own lords and ladies. Taciturn men of House Glover, hardy riders of House Ryswell, and lesser-known bannermen who had never ventured so close to southern grandeur. Margaery greeted the newcomers with courteous warmth. She made a particular effort to introduce them to the northern lords, bridging the gap of suspicion that sometimes flared in cold glances or stiff bows. Jon looked on, marveling at how naturally she navigated these courtesies. Through small compliments, sincere smiles, and well-timed acknowledgments of northern traditions, she lessened the tension that might otherwise have crackled between such disparate cultures. In the midst of these arrivals, the king's own heralds appeared. King Robert Baratheon would come north to attend the wedding, or so they declared. Queen Cersei would accompany him, along with a train of Lannister men and courtiers who rarely let the royal family out of their sight. The message carried both cheer and caution. The presence of the king would lend the wedding an undeniable importance, but it would also drape the event in more layers of politics and potential danger. No one knew what mood King Robert might be in when he finally arrived, celebratory, wrathful, or bored out of his mind. Robert was as mercurial as the storms he adored. Ned immediately prepared for the king's arrival, summoning more provisions from the surrounding farms, ensuring that Winterfell's great storerooms were ready for a feast that might last days. The king's entourage was known to be large, extravagant, and possessed of appetites both for food and amusement. In the Great Hall, servants hung banners of Baratheon stags alongside the dire wolf of Stark and the rose of Tyrell. The sense of an impending grand occasion pervaded every corner of the castle. The day King Robert Baratheon at last arrived was clear but cold, the sun bright overhead, the wind snapping the banners in the courtyard. The king's party was vast. Golden-armored guards, high-born ladies in ornate carriages, men-at-arms sporting the crowned stag on their livery. At the head rode King Robert himself, a massive figure who had once been famed for his prowess in battle and tournaments. Now he was heavier, his face touched by too many cups of strong wine and countless feasts, but his presence was still formidable. Beside him rode Queen Cersei, her golden hair tucked under a jeweled hood, her emerald eyes scanning Winterfell's courtyard with cool assessment. Ned Stark waited at the steps of the Great Keep, Lady Catelyn at his side, and their children arrayed nearby in formal attire. Robb stood tall, wearing the Stark colors. Sansa and Arya were present as well, Sansa practically trembling with excitement at the sight of the royal retinue, while Arya's expression was more restless curiosity than awe. Bran and Rickon peered out from behind them, though their mother kept them from stepping too far forward. Jon stood slightly apart, his posture stiff with uncertainty. Near him, Margaery was poised, wearing a beautifully simple gown of gray and green, a nod to both House Stark's somber tones and her own Tyrell heritage. Robert dismounted heavily, a broad grin splitting his beard. He wasted no time striding up to Ned and crushing him in a bear-like embrace. "Ned, you old dog," he boomed, laughter shaking his large belly. "It's been too long." He turned to Catelyn, greeting her with more politeness, though still jovial. "My lady, I trust you've kept him in line?" Catelyn inclined her head, maintaining a calm courtesy. "I do my best, Your Grace." Robert turned his attention to the assembled Starks. He ruffled Robb's hair, commented on how tall the boy had grown, then boomed at the sight of Sansa, declaring she looked every bit the lady. Arya drew a faint scowl from the king for standing with her shoulders back like a small soldier, but Robert let it pass with a shrug and a grin. He greeted each child with a hearty friendliness, if somewhat superficial, and then his gaze fell upon Jon. The king's jovial expression flickered. He glanced at Ned with a question in his eyes, recalling full well the rumors surrounding this black-haired boy. Everyone in the courtyard seemed to notice, a brief hush falling across the proceedings. Jon felt his cheeks burning, but he bowed low. "My king," Jon said quietly. Robert studied him a moment longer before offering a curt nod. He did not speak to Jon directly, only looked back at Ned with an unreadable expression that might have held confusion, disapproval, or simply curiosity. Then his eyes slid to Margaery, whose presence he acknowledged with a broad, if somewhat leering, smile. "And here she is," Robert said, extending a hand to Margaery, who curtsied. "The bride-to-be, Tyrell's own rose in the north. You must be half frozen, my lady. Our Ned always did love dragging fine folk up into this endless winter." Margaery rose with a gracious smile. "The north has a beauty all its own, your grace, and warmth, too, in the people who call it home." Her voice was confident, her manner calm. She might have been standing in the sunlit courtyards of Highgarden for all her composure. Robert laughed, seemingly pleased by her answer. He turned to the queen, beckoning her forward. Cersei descended from her carriage, the swirl of her gold-trimmed gown trailing behind. Her face was an exquisite mask of polite interest. She offered a thin smile to Margaery, then took the king's arm. "How lovely," Cersei said softly, her voice carrying to those nearest. "I have heard so much of Lady Margaery. The stories do not exaggerate." Margaery dipped her head in respect. "Your Grace, you honor me with your presence. The wedding will be all the grander for the crown's blessing." Cersei's emerald eyes flicked to Jon. Margaery noticed it. There was the faintest twitch at the corner of Cersei's lips, as though she were fighting the urge to smirk or sneer. But, in a well-practiced motion, the queen offered a courteous nod, sparing Jon little more than a passing glance. The tension in the courtyard loosened as servants and guards stepped forward to attend the king, stable his horse, and usher the royal party inside. Ned led Robert and Cersei into Winterfell's great hall, where a small welcoming feast had been arranged, just enough food and drink to refresh them after their travels, with promise of a grander affair that evening. Margaery and Jon stayed close by, exchanging only a brief glance. Jon could sense Margaery's resilience, the subtle way she kept her bearing despite the weight of so many strangers' eyes. He admired it more than ever. That night, the great hall was alive with music and conversation as the Northerners and Southerners mingled. Tables groaned under roast boar, venison, pies, bread, and flagons of ale and wine. King Robert seemed in high spirits, calling for more drink, demanding stories of old battles, clapping Ned on the back so hard that the North's lord nearly spilled his cup. The queen sat more quietly, occasionally murmuring with her brother Jaime, who had come as part of the royal guard, and her younger brother Tyrion, who made sardonic quips about the northern climate. Tyrion eyed Jon and Margaery with curiosity, but made no immediate approach. Jon found himself seated at the high table, as befitted the bridegroom, though he remained toward the far side. Next to him was Margaery, resplendent in a gown of shimmering dark green, embroidered with gold thread at the sleeves and neckline. The color echoed House Tyrell's rose, yet she wore a subtle direwolf pin, Sansa's gift to her, wrought by Mikken the blacksmith. That small, shining wolf's head felt like an acknowledgement of her efforts to belong in this northern stronghold. Between mouthfuls of food and cautious sips of wine, Jon responded to well wishes from both northern lords and southern knights. Some were clearly sincere. Hally's Hornwood offered a hearty congratulations and a promise that House Hornwood would stand by the new alliance. Others were more guarded, like Lord Tarly, who eyed Jon's bastard name and said little beyond the bare minimum of pleasantries. Margaery, ever the diplomat, steered conversations smoothly, turning away any barbed remarks. On the dais, King Robert alternated between regaling them with stories of old conquests and complaining about the cold. Eventually, as the night wore on and more wine flowed, his voice grew louder, his laughter more raucous. When he rose from the table, goblet in hand, the hall quieted. Robert was about to make a toast or pronouncement of some kind. Jon felt his stomach clench in apprehension. "I have come to see a wedding," Robert boomed. "And not just any wedding, but a marriage between the proud house of Stark, my dear friend Ned's house, and the fair roses of Highgarden. A brilliant match, they say, though I must admit I never expected to see old Mace Tyrell so eager to make peace with the North." He guffawed, glancing around. "But these are strange days. I say we drink to the future of this union, to Jon Snow and Margaery Tyrell. May the gods, old and new, bless them with children enough to fill half the North." A wave of laughter swept through many in the hall, though a few faces reddened at the king's bluntness. Jon gripped the table's edge, trying to keep his composure. Next to him, Margaery raised her own goblet, the faintest of smiles on her lips, as though she took no offense. Ned, from across the table, gave Jon an encouraging nod. Robert drained his goblet in one mighty swallow, then leaned forward on the table, eyeing Jon more closely. "So, bastard, is it? Well, no matter, nobler men have come from less. Your father is Ned Stark, after all. You treat this lady right, boy, or I'll have your head." The king's booming laughter echoed again, though the threat in his voice was framed by a half-drunken grin. A ripple of uncomfortable mirth passed through the crowd. Jon forced a tight smile and managed to raise his cup. "You need not worry, Your Grace," he said quietly. "I will do all that is in my power to honor this alliance." Robert stared at him for a moment, then seemed satisfied. He slapped Ned on the shoulder. "He's a serious one, this boy," he said, turning to the rest of the hall. "Just like his father when we were young." He belched, waving off the tension, and dropped back into his seat, calling for yet another refill. Cersei, all the while, maintained a distant smile. She rarely addressed Jon directly, though Margaery caught her watching with a calculating gaze more than once. The Queen's presence unsettled many in the north who had heard rumors of her ambitions and the manipulations of House Lannister. But for that evening, at least, no confrontation arose. The feast continued well into the night, guests peeling away only when the wine ran low or the music quieted. In the small hours, Jon and Margaery slipped away from the hall to find a moment's peace. They walked together through the dim corridors, candle sconces throwing flickers of orange light on cold stone. At length, they reached a balcony overlooking the courtyard, nearly deserted at that late hour. Snow had begun to drift again, soft flakes catching in the torchlight before settling onto the worn flagstones. Jon let out a breath. "That was intense," he murmured, leaning against the stone balustrade. Margaery nodded, pulling her cloak tighter around her shoulders. "King Robert can be rather overwhelming." Her voice was carefully neutral, though a hint of tension showed in her features. "And the Queen, I'm not sure what to make of her. She seems to watch everyone as though deciding where the pieces on a board should go." Jon glanced at her, seeing the exhaustion etched around her eyes. "Are you well?" She let out a small sigh. "I am, but it's a different sort of game up here than in the Reach. In Highgarden, there's warmth, greenery, music, dancing. I was raised in a world of courtesy. Here, the courtesy is sharper, more suspicious. It's not as easy to glean men's intentions." "We can handle it," Jon said, though he felt the old flicker of doubt within himself. "Our families see our marriage as a symbol. We just have to live up to that." Margaery turned her gaze to him, the hint of a smile curving her lips. "We will. I have faith in us." Gently, she placed a hand on his. "But I need to rest. Tomorrow we'll have more visitors, more toasts, more planning. And soon, the wedding itself." Jon breathed in the cold night air, feeling the chill through his cloak. "It's only a few days away now," he said, glancing up at the night sky. "I suppose we had best prepare for whatever storms come." She nodded, and they lingered side by side for a moment, gazing at the silent fall of snow. In that quiet hush, their thoughts drifted, both to the wedding and to the uncertain future that would follow. When dawn broke, Winterfell hummed with renewed activity. The king's men roamed the courtyard, demanding directions to the butts for archery practice, or seeking the mead stores. The Lannister guards lounged near the stables, close to the Queen's carriage and the golden-armored Kingsguard. Jaime Lannister was a striking presence with his regal bearing and quicksilver tongue, always near the Queen, though occasionally stepping away to sharpen his sword or practice with the men. Tyrion Lannister, dwarfed by the towering Northerners, moved about quietly, studying Winterfell's architecture and libraries, sometimes chatting with Maester Luwin about the history of the North. Ser Barristan Selmy, another Kingsguard knight, greeted Ned Stark politely. He carried the gravity of years in royal service. Ned exchanged brief words with him, reminded of the old days before Robert's rebellion, when honorable men walked a finer line. This was the swirl of figures that filled Winterfell in the days leading up to the wedding. Lords of the Reach, some of the Crown's advisors, Lannister men, and the Starks and their bannermen, each with their own agendas, each a thread in the tapestry of the Seven Kingdoms. Amid it all, Margaery and Jon were seldom left unoccupied. The wedding had to be planned with near-military precision. The ceremony, the prayers, the feast, the seating. Ned and Margaery had agreed to include elements of both the old gods and the faith of the Seven. The North's acceptance of the new gods was tenuous, but Margaery believed it essential that the Southern guests see their faith respected. So, the plan was set. The initial vows would be spoken in the Godswood by the Heart Tree in the presence of the old gods. Then, a septon, brought north with Margaery, would conduct a short faith of the Seven Blessing in the castle's small September. It was an unusual arrangement, but perhaps fitting for such a union of North and South. For attire, Margaery had chosen a gown that blended the stark, clean lines favored in Winterfell's more subdued tradition with the rich embroidery and graceful drape reminiscent of Highgarden fashions. She had even requested fur trim around the hem, a practical nod to the chill. Jon, as the groom, would wear dark gray and silver to honor House Stark's colors, with a single embroidered rose near his left shoulder, a subtle mark of House Tyrell. Some might find it strange, a rose near a direwolf's paw, but Margaery insisted it was a sign of unity. Jon had agreed, albeit with nervous humility. On one of the final days before the wedding, an unexpected meeting occurred that shaped Jon's perspective. He had gone to the library tower, seeking a moment of quiet among the shelves of old tomes. The hustle and bustle of the castle weighed on him, and he found solace in the dusty corners where ancient books lay. As he thumbed through a volume on regional customs, he heard soft footfalls behind him. He turned to see Tyrion Lannister standing there, examining a shelf with a lantern in hand. The dwarf gave Jon a thin smile. "My apologies if I startled you," Tyrion said, inclining his head. "I didn't expect anyone else here at this hour." Jon shook his head. "No apology needed, my lord." "Not my lord. I'm but a humble Lannister," Tyrion said wryly, stepping closer. He set the lantern on a table, illuminating his sharp-featured face. "You're quite the topic these days, Jon Snow. A bastard of the North, marrying Margaery Tyrell, the Rose of Highgarden. Oh, how the realm loves a curiosity." Jon tensed a fraction. "I'm sure they find it unusual," he said, attempting to keep his tone polite. "But I don't much care what they say. The alliance was made for good reason. Indeed, reasons of state, no doubt, and your father's, pardon me, your alleged father's honor." Tyrion paused, stroking his chin. "You do understand that in King's Landing, whispers swirl about your true parentage, yes?" Jon's jaw clenched. He had heard those rumors in passing. He had no real desire to dissect them with a Lannister, especially not with King Robert and Queen Cersei within earshot. "I'm aware. Rumors are common enough in the South. But I trust Lord Eddard's word." Tyrion's mismatched eyes flickered in amusement. "A wise stance. Still, it's interesting that House Tyrell is willing to wed their precious daughter to you, a man lacking name or claim. Makes one wonder what they suspect. Or know." Jon's pulse quickened. He spoke carefully, not wishing to betray any hint of the inner conflict he carried. "Lady Margaery has been gracious beyond measure. I'm sure her father saw an opportunity to strengthen ties to the North." Tyrion said. "No doubt. And the king himself is enthralled by the idea, though perhaps enthralled is the wrong word. He's more curious, as am I. You see, I have a fondness for outsiders. Cripples, bastards, broken things." His lip curled in a faint grin. "But I also see how precarious your position might be, caught between the king, the Tyrells, and the Starks." Jon studied Tyrion warily. "Are you offering counsel, my lord?" "Counsel?" Tyrion chuckled. "Perhaps. Consider that the Lannisters love to keep their eyes on new power blocks. If your marriage to Margaery cements the bond between the North and the Reach, you might one day rival the crown's influence, especially if the king's line continues to falter." He spread his hands. Just be aware that some will see you as a threat or a pawn to be used. Navigating such waters is dangerous, especially without a name. But you do seem to have the support of Ned Stark, and that is no small thing." Jon exhaled, feeling the weight of Tyrion's words. "I appreciate the warning." Tyrion shrugged, picking a book off the shelf. "Think of it as friendly advice. I bear you no ill will, Jon Snow. In fact, I rather like you. You seem far more straightforward than most of these preening lords." He tapped the tome lightly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I came here to read about the northern legends of giants. Fascinating if half of it is to be believed. Good day." With that, Tyrion departed, the soft glow of his lantern bobbing as he walked away. Jon stood there a moment longer, heart still pounding. Tyrion's words pointed to everything Jon had suspected but rarely allowed himself to think about. The realm's endless political currents that might carry him somewhere he never intended to go. He felt both exposed and strangely bolstered. If a Lannister, of all people, acknowledged his precarious but significant position, it meant that House Stark and House Tyrell truly had created something that others would watch closely. Returning to Margaery's side, Jon chose not to share every detail of Tyrion's remarks, but he hinted that the Lannisters were undoubtedly studying them. Margaery was unsurprised, though she took the information seriously. "We must tread with care," she said, reaching for his hand. "But we won't cower." The day of the wedding dawned clear and cold. A light frost clung to Winterfell's stone walls, and thin streams of early sunlight slipped through the gathering clouds overhead. Servants bustled about from the earliest hours, piling fresh rushes in the great hall, arranging flowers. Even in the north, Margaery had insisted on flowers, though they were fewer and more subdued than the vibrant blooms of Highgarden. The courtyard, too, was swept and decorated with subtle hangings that blended the Stark direwolf and the Tyrell rose. Despite the challenges, Margaery's ladies-in-waiting, along with Winterfell's staff, had managed to procure enough greenery and color to lend the day a festive air. The ceremony would unfold in two parts. First, the betrothed couple, accompanied by their families and a small gathering of onlookers, would proceed to the Godswood. The ancient weirwood stood silent and watchful, its carved face an ever-present witness to the vows of the North. After that, the party would move to the Sept, where a septon, brought north specifically for this occasion, would perform the faith of the Seven Blessing. It was unconventional, bridging two faiths in one wedding, but it suited the symbolic nature of this alliance. Jon stood in his chamber early that morning, staring at himself in a polished metal mirror. Robb helped him adjust the cloak, a thick, charcoal-gray fabric with a subtle lining of green. The embroidered rose near Jon's left shoulder was a small but significant flourish. Ghost watched from a corner of the room, ears perked, as if sensing the gravity of the day. Jon turned to Robb. "Does it look all right?" Robb's grin was immediate, bright with pride. "You look every inch a Stark, and a Tyrell, if that's possible. How do you feel?" Jon swallowed. His stomach felt like it held a nest of vipers. "Nervous," he admitted. "My entire life is about to change." Robb clapped him on the shoulder. "You're not the only one who feels that way, I'd wager. Besides, you've got all of us behind you. You'll never stand alone." A small knot of emotion formed in Jon's throat at the warmth of his brother's words. However tenuous his station, however complicated his relationship with Catelyn, he had siblings who accepted him without question. "Thank you," Jon managed. Sansa appeared, knocking lightly at the door and poking her head in. She was dressed in a lovely gown of deep blue, her hair intricately braided. "They're ready for you," she said, smiling nervously. "You look handsome, Jon." He tried to return her smile. "Thank you, Sansa. You look beautiful yourself." She bobbed a small curtsy, then turned to hurry back down the corridor. Robb gave Jon one last pat on the back. "Shall we?" They made their way through the halls, where a hush seemed to reign. Everyone was in position or rushing to get there. Servants, lords, and ladies alike paused to watch as Jon passed, bowing or curtsying with a mixture of curiosity and respect. He felt like an intruder in a dream, wearing fine clothes and heading to wed the daughter of a great southern house. At last, Jon reached the courtyard, where Ned Stark waited with a line of northern bannermen. Margaery was not yet visible. Tradition demanded the bride appear separately. The sun was higher now, the crisp morning air nipping at exposed skin. Some of the southern visitors shivered and drew their cloaks tighter. King Robert stood off to one side, flanked by the Queen and her brothers, a sour expression hinting that he would rather be feasting than attending formalities. Yet he had arrived for the spectacle, to show the realm that the crown supported this union. Ned gave Jon a steady nod, eyes filled with a father's quiet pride. "Are you ready?" he asked. Jon inhaled. "As ready as I'll ever be." A trumpet sounded, only a brief note, for this was not a tournament but a wedding procession. The watchers turned as Margaery Tyrell emerged from a side corridor, flanked by her ladies-in-waiting. She wore a gown of layered gray and green silk, trimmed with silver fur at the collar and cuffs, and a delicate belt shaped like entwined roses and direwolves. Her hair was partially bound, dark curls cascading around her shoulders, and a soft white veil framed her face. Despite the chill, her posture was as composed as if she walked through Highgarden's mild spring. The courtyard hushed. Even King Robert seemed briefly caught by the sight. Margaery's gaze swept over the crowd, then found Jon. She smiled, a genuine, gentle expression that sent warmth flooding through Jon's chest. One of her ladies handed her a small bouquet of winter roses, pale blue blossoms grown, with some difficulty, in the glass gardens of Winterfell. She held them carefully, as though they were precious tokens. At a signal from Ned Stark, Jon stepped forward, meeting Margaery at the center of the courtyard. She curtsied lightly. He bowed, capturing her hand in his. The hush deepened, and they turned as one toward the open gate that led toward the Godswood. The procession moved quietly through Winterfell's corridors, past watchers who stood aside in reverence. Snow dusted the stone pathways outside. The air smelled of pine and cold earth. Behind Jon and Margaery walked their families. Ned and Catelyn, King Robert and Queen Cersei, Ser Loras Tyrell, Robb, Sansa, Arya, Bran, and Rickon. Lords and ladies followed in their wake, forming an orderly line. Soft chatter and the shuffle of cloaks punctuated the otherwise silent morning. The Godswood greeted them with a hush of wind through the dark red leaves of the weirwood. A thin layer of snow blanketed the grass, and the little pond near the heart tree was partially iced over. The carved face in the weirwood's trunk seemed to watch them with ancient, knowing eyes. This was where the North had always wed under the old god's witness. Simple ceremonies, solemn vows. Today, though, it was attended by more finery and far more spectators than the quiet copse was accustomed to. They came to a stop near the heart tree, where a space had been cleared of snow. Ned Stark stood forth as the Warden of the North, a father giving away his son, even if that son bore the name Snow. Silence draped the gathering. The only sound was the rustle of cloaks and the distant caw of a crow. Margaery and Jon turned to face each other, hands clasped. Ned spoke in a low, resonant voice. "We stand here before the old gods, to witness the union of Jon Snow and Margaery of House Tyrell. Let all here bear witness to the vows they will speak, and may the old gods watch over them." He stepped back, inclining his head to Jon. Jon swallowed, feeling the gaze of the entire realm upon him, but he forced his voice to remain steady. "Margaery," he began, "I take you as my wife to stand by your side, to honor you, to protect you, and to cherish you. I swear by the old gods that I will keep you safe and keep our vows, so long as we both live." A hush fell. Margaery's eyes glistened, though whether from emotion or the cold was hard to say. She spoke in a clear, measured tone that carried in the quiet wood. "Jon Snow, I take you as my husband, to stand by your side, to honor you, to support you, and to cherish you. I swear by the old gods to keep our vows, so long as we both live." Ned gestured for them to face the heart tree. Jon and Margaery turned to it, letting silence fill the moment. Many of the Northmen lowered their heads, lips moving in silent prayer to the old gods. The southern guests watched with curiosity. Then Ned stepped forward once more. "Under the eyes of the old gods, I proclaim you man and wife." A beat passed, stillness, reverence. Margaery looked at Jon, and a soft smile curved her lips. Jon squeezed her hand gently, nearly overwhelmed by the realization that the vow was now a living bond between them, recognized before the oldest powers of the North. Then, in an echoing hush, the gathered crowd began to move, filing out of the Godswood. The second part of the ceremony would take place in the small sept, a symbolic nod to the faith of the Seven. Margaery's hand slid into Jon's arm, and they followed the king, the queen, and the rest through Winterfell's corridors once more. Inside the sept, candles flickered on a modest altar. The stained glass windows were nowhere near as grand as those in the Great September of Baelor, but a soft rainbow of light still washed over the stone floor. A septon in pale robes waited, a warm expression on his face. Margaery and Jon approached, with Ned, Catelyn, and Margaery's brother Loras standing as witnesses. The septon raised his hands. "We stand now before the Seven, who guide us through their aspects. Father, mother, warrior, maiden, smith, crone, stranger. Margaery of House Tyrell and Jon Snow seek their blessing upon the vows they have spoken." Margaery spoke first this time, repeating a concise vow to uphold her duties as a wife under the Seven, to be guided by the mother's compassion and the maiden's virtue. Jon followed suit, speaking words of loyalty and protection, guided by the warrior's strength and the father's judgment. The septon then offered a short prayer, calling upon the Seven to sanctify their union. A final swirl of candlelight flickered around them, and in that gentle illumination, the septon nodded. "By the will of the gods, old and new, and by the witness of these assembled, I bless this union." With that, the ceremony was complete. No one spoke for a long moment, until the king clapped his hands in a sudden burst of enthusiasm. "Well, that's done then," Robert boomed, making some of the southern ladies jump. A ripple of relieved laughter spread through the congregation. Margaery and Jon turned to face the watchers. Her cheeks were flushed, perhaps from the cold or the significance of the moment, while Jon felt a mix of exhilaration and solemnity. They walked out of the sept as husband and wife, stepping into a corridor where well-wishers began to gather. Loras Tyrell smiled warmly at his sister, leaning in to kiss her cheek. Sansa beamed, practically dancing on her toes to catch Margaery's eye. Arya lingered near the back, looking simultaneously impressed and disdainful of all the ceremony. Ned patted Jon's shoulder, pride etched in his features. Even Catelyn managed a small, courteous smile, though there was still an undercurrent in her eyes, an uncertainty about the shift in Jon's status. A wave of cheers greeted them in the courtyard when they emerged fully. Robb led the throng of northern men shouting their congratulations. The Tyrell knights added their voices, lifting the golden rose banners high. King Robert bellowed for more wine. Servants scurried to and fro, beginning preparations for the grand feast that would overtake Winterfell for the rest of the day and well into the night. Bards tuned their lutes and harps, jugglers practiced cartwheels, and cooks rushed to the kitchens to begin roasting entire boars and side after side of venison. Jon and Margaery, at last, found themselves briefly alone in a small alcove off the great hall. Servants bustled past, carrying trays of freshly polished cups, but none intruded on the bride and groom. Margaery exhaled, leaning her back against the cool stone wall, the faint tremble of excitement still in her posture. "We're married," Jon said softly, a wonder in his voice. Margaery's lips curved into a bright smile. "We are. How do you feel, husband?" Jon let out a breath that misted in the chilly air. "I never expected this in my life, but I'm glad. I truly am." She reached out, threading her fingers through his. "As am I. Let's hope the rest of the day is less daunting than the ceremony." They shared a quiet laugh. Then Margaery glanced toward the hall. "We should go. Our guests will be waiting." Jon nodded, but before they turned, he gently lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. Their eyes met, and in that shared moment, they both sensed the enormity of what had just occurred. However uncertain the realm's future might be, they were bound now. Two people from distant corners of Westeros, forging a path that might reshape the alliances of great houses. Jon felt a swirl of pride, protectiveness, and tentative joy all mingled in his chest. They entered the great hall to the sound of applause. Torches blazed along the walls, and the dais table was resplendent with gold and silver dishes. Minstrels struck up a lively tune as servants poured wine into tall goblets. The feast had begun. The wedding feast at Winterfell was a spectacle seldom seen in the north. Tables were laden with food enough to satisfy even the king's appetite. Roast swan, honey-glazed hams, spiced sausages, trencher bread filled with thick stews, baked apples dusted with cinnamon, and a variety of pies, pigeon, pork, turnip. Casks of ale and mead were tapped, and lordly vintages of wine from the arbor flowed freely. The hall echoed with laughter and chatter, the clink of cups, the swirl of dancing couples to the minstrels' tunes. Jon and Margaery were seated at the high table, placed between Ned and King Robert. On Margaery's other side sat Catelyn, while next to Ned stood Queen Cersei, wearing a fixed smile that rarely reached her eyes. The newlyweds endured a steady stream of toasts, from Robb, from Ser Loras, from Lord Tarly, from various northern bannermen, and from Robert himself, who was already well on his way to being drunk. Despite the noise and the demands of polite conversation, Jon felt buoyed by Margaery's presence at his side. Whenever she sensed his discomfort, at a crude jest by a tipsy lord, or the pointed stares of certain guests, she intervened with a deft word or a gentle change of subject. Each time, Jon was reminded how formidable an ally she was in these political waters. More than once, Ned caught his son's eye and nodded approval, as if to say, "This is why we accepted this match." Partway through the feast, the king insisted on a demonstration of skill. "Let's see some sport," Robert roared, slamming his goblet down so hard that wine sloshed over the rim. "Bring in the boar spears, or have the archers show their mettle." Ned rose, trying to smooth the king's wishes into something feasible indoors. "Your Grace, we can arrange a small contest of archery in the courtyard, if it pleases you." Robert clapped his hands. "Excellent, and perhaps that direwolf pup could chase a hare for us." Jon frowned, feeling a surge of protectiveness for Ghost. But the king was in high spirits, so Jon spoke calmly. "Ghost isn't fond of performing, Your Grace. He's a bit independent." Robert waved dismissively. "Bah, so be it. Let us watch the archers instead. You'll see, my sweet queen." He turned to Cersei. "The Northerners can loose an arrow even with half-frozen fingers." Cersei merely smiled with thin politeness, though Tyrion, seated further down, snorted quietly into his wine. The brief contest was arranged quickly, with a few targets set up in the courtyard outside. Some of the lords and knights, slightly inebriated, braved the cold to show off. Ser Loras Tyrell demonstrated impressive skill, striking near the bullseye from a considerable distance. Robb Stark proved no slouch, landing his arrows in tight grouping as well. Theon Greyjoy shot wide once but recovered with a skilled final shot. King Robert bellowed encouragement and half-stumbled about, calling for more wine. Meanwhile, Margaery watched from a vantage point near the steps, politely applauding each shot. Amid the amusement, the sun sank lower, the northern twilight lengthening. Servants lit torches around the courtyard, illuminating the drifting snow. Eventually, the crowd drifted back into the warmth of the great hall, where the feast continued unabated. As the evening wore on, the custom of the bedding ceremony loomed. It was a tradition in many parts of Westeros, though one that House Stark did not always practice. Margaery had read about it, and while she found it a bit uncouth, guests drunkenly undressing the bride and groom before sending them to bed, she also knew it was often considered part of a grand wedding. She braced herself for it, determined not to show discomfort. But Ned stood near the dais when the time came, raising a hand to quiet the rowdy shouts. "The North has its own ways," he began, voice carrying. "Tonight, we will forgo the bedding ceremony. Let the new couple retire in peace and dignity. We are not a house known for prying eyes." A few drunken lords grumbled in disappointment. Lord Umber, already half swallowed by ale, loudly protested that a bedding was a vital part of any wedding. But Ned's word was law in Winterfell, and Margaery cast him a grateful glance. Across the dais, Robert only shrugged, too deep in his cups to care. Cersei's expression remained unreadable. Margaery felt a subtle shift of relief. She had been prepared for the worst, but she appreciated that Ned would extend such courtesy. If anything, it reinforced her respect for the North, and for Jon's father, who quietly shielded them from the rowdier Southern tradition. When it became clear that the newlyweds would be allowed to depart without the humiliating spectacle, well-wishers came forward in a more orderly manner to bid them good night. Robb clasped Jon's forearm, a grin lighting his face. Sansa embraced Margaery, whispering congratulations with an almost sisterly affection. Arya hovered uncertainly before Margaery, then offered a small nod that might have been her version of thanks for not letting the day descend into pure Southern excess. Bran and Rickon scampered around, wide-eyed at the noise and festivities, though Catelyn gently guided them aside so that Jon and Margaery could slip away. Thus, at last, Jon Snow and Margaery Tyrell, now Snow in name, though she retained her own as well, were escorted to the bridal chamber. Two of Margaery's ladies giggled behind her as they helped gather her gown's trailing fabric. Jon felt his heart hammering in his chest, a mixture of anticipation and nerves. His entire life had changed in a matter of hours. He was a husband, joined to one of the most significant houses in the realm. And beyond that formal bond, he cared for Margaery more than he dared admit. They stepped into the chamber, a cozy room in one of Winterfell's towers, warmed by a crackling fire. The bed was layered with thick furs. A few candles glowed on the table, and a jug of mulled wine stood on a small stand. Once the door closed behind them, the noise of the feast faded, replaced by the gentle snap of burning logs. Margaery set down her bouquet of winter roses, removing the veil from her hair. She turned to Jon, a slight smile curling her lips. "We've done it," she said softly, stepping closer. "We've truly done it." Jon could only nod, a shy smile tugging at his mouth. He reached for her hand. "I'm grateful," he whispered. "Grateful to have you as my wife." She leaned in, resting her brow against his. "And you as my husband." Jon eased his hands up to cradle her face, and they kissed. A gentle, unhurried meeting of lips that carried the weight of all the day's ceremony. In the quiet hush of the chamber, they found a tentative tenderness, a moment of peace after the swirling tumult of the wedding feast. Margaery's hair smelled faintly of lavender, a southern fragrance that seemed foreign in the north. But Jon welcomed it, as he welcomed the warmth of her arms around him. They spoke a little in hushed tones about the day, the sight of the king's drunken grin, the tension in the queen's eyes, the archery in the cold courtyard. They shared a small laugh at the memory of Lord Umber's booming protest about the bedding ceremony. In that quiet talk, they settled the last of their nerves. Eventually, they let the day's exhaustion wash over them. The door's latch fell into place, sealing them in a private world that was theirs alone. The next morning, Winterfell stirred later than usual. Many of the guests nursed sore heads from too much wine, and the king himself did not rise until well after sunrise. When he did, his mood was sour, complaining of the meager southern sunlight in the north. But the day was bright enough for all that, the sun glinting off patches of snow and shining on the towers. Jon and Margaery emerged from their chamber to greetings that were by turns polite and boisterous. Some lords slapped Jon's shoulder, congratulating him with winks and ribald jests. Ladies of the Reach murmured compliments to Margaery on her poise and grace. Sansa hovered, eager for every detail, though she contained herself with decorum. Arya rolled her eyes at the fuss, more interested in practicing with a wooden sword in the courtyard than indulging in wedding gossip. Ned had planned for the king to remain in Winterfell a few days longer, to finalize discussions about the realm's state of affairs. Robert seemed little interested in governance, more eager to hunt or eat or drown in mead. But Ned pressed him gently, describing the North's needs, the cost of the king's visit, and the possibility of forging new trade routes with the Reach. Meanwhile, Margaery's father, Mace Tyrell, had sent a message that he might journey north as well, though not immediately. He claimed pressing matters in Highgarden. Whether that was to avoid the northern cold or to maintain plausible deniability in case the wedding faced any hidden opposition, none could say. In those days following the wedding, Jon and Margaery began to settle into a routine of shared duties and quiet companionship. Together, they visited the library to speak with Maester Luwin about potential expansions of farmland in the north, fueled by the new alliance with the Reach. Grain shipments might flow north more reliably. In exchange, the north would send more pelts, timber, and minerals south. Margaery, with her deft political sense, suggested that the Tyrells also consider investing in northern roads, ensuring easier passage for goods year-round. Jon listened, contributing his own knowledge of the terrain, while Luwin took notes with keen interest. Outside, in the courtyard, Margaery sometimes watched as Jon sparred with Robb and Theon. She found herself impressed anew by Jon's skill, the quick reflexes and calm focus that belied his intense nature. Meanwhile, she devoted time to learning more about the castle's day-to-day management, advising the steward on meal plans for the king's entourage, working with the stablemaster to ensure the southern horses were properly cared for in the cold, and ensuring supplies of feed were not unduly strained. She often crossed paths with Catelyn Stark in those responsibilities. The air between them remained somewhat cautious, but Margaery's unassuming courtesy and genuine desire to help the castle function gradually eased Catelyn's wariness. One day, they stood together in the storeroom, examining the inventory of salted fish and dried meats. Winter was receding, but no one in the north was foolish enough to waste a single resource. Margaery asked questions, gleaning how the Starks managed provisions in the face of unpredictable weather. Catelyn answered with guarded politeness, but at length, she offered a small piece of praise, how Margaery's suggestions about rotating older stores to the front of the usage list were sensible. It was a humble moment, but it felt like a small step toward acceptance. Occasionally, the new couple would steal quiet moments to themselves, small walks by the wall, visits to the Godswood, or just hushed conversations in a window seat overlooking the courtyard. If any servants whispered about how quickly they seemed to find comfort in each other's presence, neither Jon nor Margaery took offense. After all, this was the heart of a political marriage that had, somehow, begun to blossom into genuine closeness. But a shadow loomed in the form of the king's continued presence. Robert's mood varied day by day. Sometimes he was jovial, recounting tales of battles, praising Ned, and expressing curiosity about the north. Other times he was sullen or argumentative, snapping at his squires, ignoring the queen, and complaining about trifles. Cersei remained a poised, golden statue at his side, polite in conversation but unyielding in her closeted judgments. On the fourth day after the wedding, Robert declared he would go on a hunt in the nearby Wolfswood. The day was crisp and bright, perfect for riding, he said, and he wanted to see some northern game worth spearing. Ned looked uneasy, remembering all too well the last time Robert had visited Winterfell years ago, and the disasters that had followed in King's Landing. But he agreed, offering an escort of Stark men to guide the king through the forest. Jon and Margaery watched from the gatehouse as Robert, clad in thick furs, rode out with a small retinue that included the ever-present Jaime Lannister, a handful of Lannister guards, and a few men of the north. The queen remained behind, citing a headache, though her cold glance over the courtyard suggested she simply had no interest in tramping through the snow. As the hunting party vanished beyond the walls, Margaery turned to Jon with a faint smile. At least the castle will be quieter. Perhaps we can accomplish more in his absence. Jon nodded, exhaling. I can only hope he returns satisfied. I've seen hunts in this region go poorly when men underestimate the beasts that roam our woods. She slipped her arm through his, leaning in. He may be reckless, but he's still king. Let's trust the old gods to keep him safe. They retreated inside, intending to spend the day reviewing letters from Highgarden and discussing future plans with Ned. But soon after they settled in Ned's solar, a messenger arrived with news that could not be ignored. A raven from Castle Black, reporting unsettling activity beyond the wall. Whispers of wildlings gathering in unusual numbers. Strange sightings in the deep forest. Ned read the note with a furrowed brow. "It seems your Uncle Benjen has reported an influx of wildlings," Ned told Jon. "They're pushing south and the watch is worried. One of their rangers claims to have seen, well, monstrous things, but it's likely just wildling raids." Jon's face tensed at the mention of his uncle. "Should we send aid?" Ned set down the parchment. "Winterfell's resources are stretched with the king's visit, but I'll consider dispatching a few more men to the Night's Watch once the king departs. Let us hope it's only an exaggerated rumor." A silence fell, broken by Margaery's thoughtful voice. "If there is trouble beyond the wall, wouldn't it be wise to ensure the new trade routes we're establishing don't suffer from raiding wildlings in the future?" Ned looked at her, slightly surprised that she would think of such a thing. "Yes, my lady, you're correct. The safety of the roads is paramount." She offered a small nod, stepping back to let Ned and Jon consider the details. Jon glanced at her gratefully. This was part of why he admired her. She thought ahead, never just reacting to immediate issues. Over the next 2 days, the king's presence was felt only in the distant echo of horns as his hunting party ventured out and returned intermittently for fresh supplies or to deposit whatever game they'd caught. Robert seemed to enjoy the hunts, though he complained about the cold. Then, on the 3rd day, near sunset, horns blew from the gatehouse. King Robert's party was returning, but with an air of urgency. Men scrambled in the courtyard to greet them, and Ned descended from his solar to see what the commotion was about. Jon, Margaery, and other members of the household followed in a tense group. Robert rode in, slumping in the saddle, face pale and twisted with pain. Blood stained his furs. A boar's tusk had torn into him in a brief moment of carelessness. Jaime Lannister held the king's reins, guiding the horse as carefully as possible. Behind them, 2 other knights carried the carcass of a massive boar, tusks glinting with dried blood. Cersei, who had come to the courtyard with a retinue of her ladies, pressed a hand to her mouth in horror, though her green eyes flashed with something unreadable. Ned rushed to Robert's side, helping Jaime lift him from the horse. Robert let out a groan of pain, staggering to keep his feet. "Damn beast came out of nowhere," he wheezed, sweat beading on his brow. We were at the edge of the woods. I drank too much wine." His words slurred as the men-at-arms carried him into the castle, rushing to lay him in a large guest chamber where the maester was summoned at once. The boar had gored the king's side, and though the wound was not immediately fatal, it was deep, oozing blood and threatening infection. Maester Luwin set about cleaning and stitching, administering potent milk of the poppy to quell Robert's pain. The entire castle buzzed with alarm. If the king died in the north under Ned's roof, the ramifications could be monumental. Lannister men glowered in the corridors, while Queen Cersei remained at Robert's bedside, pale and silent. Jaime and Tyrion consulted in hushed tones near the door, tension carving lines on their faces. Ned stood watch, worry etched into every crease. Jon and Margaery lingered at the fringes, powerless to help. When Ned emerged from the chamber, brow beaded with sweat, he let out a heavy breath. "The maester says the wound is serious, but the king may yet recover if the infection doesn't spread. We must wait, and we must keep the castle calm." That wait stretched into several days. Robert drifted in and out of feverish consciousness, calling sometimes for Ned, other times for a drink, and occasionally muttering the names of his old friends or lovers in his delirium. Cersei rarely left his side, nor did Ser Barristan Selmy. Tyrion Lannister took up a vigil in the library, reading quietly, though now and then he emerged to speak in low tones with Jaime or the Queen's handmaidens. Rumors flew, that the king was dying, that he'd be dead by dawn, that he was improving, that the gods had cursed the north. No one knew the truth for certain, and tension mounted in every corner of Winterfell. Margaery found herself pulled between her new role and the swirl of court politics that accompanied a king's incapacitation. She did her best to maintain calm among the southern knights who questioned her, but she had no official authority. Jon felt a frustration simmer. He was a newlywed husband, yet powerless to affect the realm's direction should Robert die. He confided his concerns to Ned one evening, the two standing in a deserted corridor lit only by a single torch. If King Robert passes, the throne would pass to his son Joffrey, Ned said grimly. But that boy is no friend to the north, and his mother's ambitions are well known. Jon nodded, anxiety gnawing at him. Then war could come. The Lannisters will want to tighten their grip, the Tyrells might see an opportunity, and the North could be caught in the middle. Ned's lips pressed into a thin line. Exactly. I pray Robert recovers. For all his faults, he has at least kept the peace. In the meantime, keep your wits about you. The Lannisters are watching, as is everyone else. Over the next 2 nights, Robert's fever finally broke. Maester Luwin announced cautiously that the king was showing signs of improvement, though he was far from well. Relief spread through the castle, though it was tempered by caution. Robert would need time, weeks perhaps, to recover enough to travel. In the meantime, Winterfell remained crowded with courtiers and knights, all of whom had to be housed and fed. Margaery did her utmost to ensure the supplies didn't dwindle, conferring with the stewards about distributing rations. She even suggested that some of the Lannister guard might relocate to a nearby holdfast or pitch tents in the yard to reduce strain on the castle's rooms. The queen, when approached, refused to send her men outside, citing concerns for their comfort in the north's cold. So the tension festered. At last, with Robert's health no longer in immediate danger, he was able to speak more coherently. Ned visited him in the chambers, only to find Cersei present, watching with hawk-like wariness. Robert, propped up on pillows, beckoned Ned closer. "Ned," he rasped. "The huntsman says the boar was massive, biggest he's seen. I told him we'd mount those tusks in the Red Keep." He managed a weak laugh, then grimaced as pain bit him. "Damn me, I should have listened to your warnings about the drink." Ned placed a hand on Robert's uninjured shoulder. "You'll recover, Robert, and you'll return to the capital soon enough." Robert grunted, looking around as though noticing the chamber for the first time. "I'll need to. Rumor has it the Targaryen girl across the sea is stirring up trouble. But for now, you'll remain here, with your new alliances." "Yes." His words slurred a touch, eyes drifting to Cersei. She pressed her lips together. Ned nodded. "Jon Snow has wed Margaery Tyrell. The alliance is set. We'll do our part for the realm, as we always have." "Good," Robert said, then closed his eyes with a groan. "Just keep those Tyrells from swallowing half the kingdom. I'll not see the rose overshadow the stag." A wave of exhaustion overcame him, and his eyes slid shut. Cersei watched Ned from across the bed, her face unreadable. As Ned turned to leave, she spoke in a low tone, just loud enough for him to hear. "Your new family connections may give you illusions of strength, Lord Stark. Be cautious that your illusions do not lead you astray." Ned paused, a flash of anger stirring in his chest. He turned back to Cersei. "My lady, you forget yourself." "Do I?" she replied coolly, adjusting one of Robert's pillows. "I am queen." For a moment, the tension in the room crackled. Then Ned exhaled, turning away without further retort. He was not a man for petty arguments, and Robert's weakened condition made confrontation unwise. Still, he felt a dark foreboding settle in his gut. Days stretched into a week, and King Robert's health improved enough that he could sit up and drink light broths, though he was still unable to walk unaided. The queen grew impatient, wanting to return south before the roads turned muddy. She insisted that if Robert was well enough to ride in a litter, they should depart for King's Landing at once. Robert, stubborn and prideful, refused to leave until he could mount a horse on his own 2 feet. So the stalemate continued, and Winterfell remained host to the uneasy presence of the crown. During this time, Margaery and Jon attempted to live out their newlywed days in relative calm. Their private moments were precious respites from the swirling politics. In the mornings, they broke fast together on simple fare, warm bread, boiled eggs, and sometimes a side of bacon. Margaery often teased that she missed the lavish spreads of Highgarden, but she never truly complained. Jon enjoyed hearing her talk of the Reach, describing orchards in bloom and gardens bursting with roses. He, in turn, told her the old stories of the first men and the children of the forest, of how Winterfell's walls were said to be warmed by hot springs that had been channeled by Brandon the Builder. As their bond grew, so too did the acceptance of the Northmen. If, in the first weeks, some of the lords had resented the idea of a bastard forging such a grand match, those doubts began to fade when they saw Margaery's respect for northern ways and Jon's continued humility in dealing with them. Jon remained the same conscientious young man they had known, only now with a quiet confidence he had lacked before. He had, at last, a place that felt truly his, a partner at his side. Yet, news from the south never ceased. Ravens brought word of tensions in Dorne, murmurs of conflict brewing in the Stormlands, and the uncertain movements of Viserys Targaryen in Essos. Ned spent long hours with his advisors and wrote countless letters, hoping to keep the North stable if the rest of the realm fractured. Jon occasionally sat in on these discussions, learning more about the responsibilities that might befall him should war come. One gray afternoon, with the clouds hanging low over Winterfell's towers, Catelyn approached Margaery in the library, her posture stiff but her eyes carrying determination. They had rarely been alone since the wedding. Servants or other ladies were often present, or they crossed paths in corridors where they exchanged courtesies and parted. "My lady," Catelyn said softly, glancing around the quiet room. Shelves of old tomes lined the walls, their spines cracked from centuries of use. Margaery rose from a chair by the window, setting aside a book of northern ballads. "Lady Stark," she replied, giving a respectful nod. "Is there something I can help you with?" Catelyn's lips parted, then pressed into a fine line, as though she weighed her words carefully. "I wanted to speak to you about Jon." Margaery tipped her head, heart fluttering slightly. Of all the subjects Catelyn might wish to discuss, Jon was likely the most fraught. "Yes, of course." Catelyn's blue eyes flicked to the open door, then back to Margaery. She moved closer, lowering her voice. "I know you two have formed a bond. I see it. The North sees it. And I would be blind not to acknowledge that you care for each other." Margaery offered a small, cautious smile, unsure of what Catelyn intended. "Yes, my lady, we do." Catelyn exhaled, clasping her hands in front of her. "Jon has always been an uncomfortable reminder for me. He is Ned's blood, but not mine. She paused as though the words cost her. "I have not always treated him fairly. My children adore him as a brother, but for many years, I let bitterness cloud my heart." Margaery listened intently, compassion stirring in her. "Lady Stark, you owe me no explanation, but Jon never spoke ill of you. He respects you." A flicker of conflict passed over Catelyn's face. "That is Jon's way. He is honorable like Ned. Came to say, I can see how happy he is with you. I will not stand in the way of that happiness." The admission seemed to weigh heavily in the air. Margaery reached out and gently touched Catelyn's arm. "I understand it must be difficult for you. I only hope I can ease any burdens between you." Catelyn met Margaery's gaze, and something like relief glimmered there. "I suppose we shall see. But I wanted you to know, I will not oppose this union, for what my word is worth." Her tone softened, and she lowered her eyes. "Welcome to the family, Lady Margaery." In that moment, Margaery recognized the depth of the gesture. Catelyn Stark was not a woman who easily let go of grudges or pain, but for the sake of her family's future, she was trying. Margaery gave a slight nod, warmth touching her expression. "Thank you. I value that." They parted soon after, each sensing that too many words might spoil the fragile accord. But as Margaery left the library, her footsteps were light. She felt as though the final barrier in Winterfell had begun to yield. Catelyn Stark's acceptance was not total or unreserved, but it was a step. That evening, when she recounted the exchange to Jon, he listened with eyes wide, and his lips curved in a grateful smile. It was a piece of peace he had never expected. After almost 3 weeks at Winterfell, King Robert's condition improved to the point where he could walk with the aid of a cane. Muttering curses about boars and northern chill, he announced his intention to depart within a day or two, determined to reach King's Landing before any further mishaps befell him. He summoned Ned to a private audience, where Robert again hammered home the need for the North to remain vigilant and to keep the Tyrell alliance under control. Ned navigated the conversation as best he could, extracting half-promises from Robert about repaying the costs of his extended stay, though the king brushed off specifics. On the day of departure, the courtyard was a flurry of activity. Servants loaded wagons, squires readied horses, and knights checked their gear. The queen, arrayed in rich crimson and gold, supervised the loading of her personal carriage. Jaime Lannister stood by, scanning the surroundings. Tyrion was nowhere to be seen, having left earlier on some separate business or personal journey. No one seemed certain. Meanwhile, King Robert had insisted on mounting a horse himself, though he winced with every movement. Cersei approached Margaery briefly, offering a tight-lipped smile. "My father will be interested to hear about this union. I trust you will remain cooperative with the crown." Margaery inclined her head calmly. "House Tyrell and House Stark remain loyal to the throne, Your Grace." "Indeed," Cersei said, gaze flicking to Jon. "And your new husband, well, let us hope he proves worthy of the honor bestowed upon him." With that, she swept away, not waiting for a response. Jon, standing by Margaery's side, tensed, but Margaery lightly placed a hand on his arm, guiding him away from conflict. Robert offered a last round of hearty farewells and curses at the cold, then led his procession through Winterfell's gates, the Lannister banners trailing behind. With thunder of hooves and creak of wagons, they vanished down the King's Road, leaving only a swirl of dust and half-melted snow in their wake. In the sudden quiet of the courtyard, Ned, Catelyn, and their household let out a collective sigh of relief. Robb turned to Jon, grinning. "That was quite a stay. The king knows how to liven things up. I'll give him that." Jon breathed a laugh, though it was tinged with weariness. Margaery exhaled beside him, her eyes following the last hint of banners in the distance. "That was my first prolonged meeting with the crown," she murmured. "It was illuminating." Ned stepped forward, hands clasped behind his back. "Now that they're gone, we can turn our energies to truly securing this alliance. Trade agreements, the flow of goods, the management of any potential conflicts, and we can begin to see to our own houses." He looked at Jon and Margaery. "You have done well, both of you." Margaery dipped her head. "Thank you, Lord Stark." Jon nodded in quiet gratitude. For a moment, he sensed the magnitude of what had transpired. They had weathered a royal visit, cemented a wedding that bound the North to the Reach, and escaped the worst of potential political calamity after the king's injury. But this was only the beginning. The Seven Kingdoms were restless, and storms brewed on every horizon. Lannister ambition, Targaryen claims, wildling unrest, and the threat of winter's eventual arrival. Despite the swirl of uncertainty, there was a flicker of hope. Jon Snow, once just the bastard of Winterfell, now stood at the start of a new chapter with Margaery Tyrell, now Margaery Snow in the north, by his side. Their union, however unlikely at first, had already begun to shape fortunes across the realm. And as they walked together from the courtyard back into the familiar halls of Winterfell, hand in hand, they clung to that hope. Whatever battles lay ahead, they would face them together, forging a future where the wolves of the north and the roses of the Reach might stand as one.